Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into a historical and spiritual mystery that has literally puzzled scholars for generations. We're talking about a story hidden right in the middle of ancient texts, centered around a fascinating guy named Ezra. It's a story about rebuilding after total destruction. But, as we'll discover together, it's about rebuilding something way more enduring than just brick and mortar.
The historical mystery.
So, to really understand the true genius of Ezra, we first have to untangle this massive historical knot. You see, the timeline of the Israelite return from exile in Babylon is, well, it's widely misunderstood. It all starts with what seems like a super simple question. When exactly did the return from Babylon happen? But don't let that fool you. This actually hides a massive historical puzzle.
Okay, let's look at how the traditional timeline has been laid out for a long time. First, Babylon destroys Jerusalem in 587 BC, right? Then, about 50 years later, in 538 BC, the first group returns under Zerubbabel to rebuild the temple. Then, and here's where it gets tricky, traditionally, the second return happens under Ezra in 458 BC. And finally, Nehemiah comes along in 444 BC to rebuild the city walls. But wait. Look closely at the math here. There is a huge 80-year gap between the first and second returns. Even between the temple being finished and Ezra arriving, you're looking at nearly a 60-year gap. I mean, these major biblical figures basically belong to completely different eras.
And this traditional timeline, it actually exposes a massive logical flaw. See, later in Ezra's own writings, during a prayer, he thanks God for giving them a wall in Judah and Jerusalem. But hold on a second. If Ezra arrived in 458 BC, that is a full 14 years before Nehemiah supposedly even showed up to build the wall. So why in the world does Ezra's prayer mention a finished wall? It just doesn't add up.
Let's get into part 2, the true order.
So that glaring contradiction means we really need to re-examine the historical records, specifically the meticulously kept archives of the Persian Empire. And here is the plot twist you've been waiting for. The text tells us Ezra arrived in the 7th year of King Artaxerxes. Now, the traditional view just assumed this was Artaxerxes I, placing the event at 458 BC. But, as history buffs out there probably know, ancient royals weren't exactly super creative with naming their kids, right? There was absolutely more than one King Artaxerxes. If the text is actually referring to Artaxerxes II, well, the timeline radically shifts. Ezra's arrival wouldn't be 458 BC, it would be 398 BC. That is a full 60 years later.
Now look at how perfectly this corrected view aligns the whole historical narrative. It's like a giant puzzle finally snapping together. First, Zerubbabel returns in 538 BC and builds the temple. Then Nehemiah arrives in 444 BC and builds the wall. And finally, well after those physical structures are totally completed, Ezra arrives on the scene in 398 BC. This solves the contradiction completely, right? When Ezra prays about the wall, it makes perfect sense because Nehemiah had already built it.
Part 3, Beyond the Walls.
Now you might be wondering, why does this chronological reshuffling matter so much? Well, because it unlocks a really profound theological climax. We have to contrast the physical structures with the spiritual architecture here. Zerubbabel, he built the physical temple. Nehemiah built the physical wall to defend the city from invaders. Sure, it looked like a real city again. But here's the thing. A secure city is completely useless if the people inside don't even know who they are. Ezra wasn't sent to work with bricks. No, he was sent to construct a spiritual defense.
And this is actually proven by the official Persian decree itself. Remarkably, the biblical text preserves King Artaxerxes' original decree in its native Aramaic language, pulled directly from the Persian archives. And get this, the king doesn't ask Ezra to build any buildings. Nope. He commands him to appoint magistrates and judges who know the laws of your God and teach those who do not know them. The buildings were already standing. What was missing was the word, which was desperately needed to build up the people.
Moving on to part 4, the word expert.
To fulfill this monumental task of teaching a completely lost people who they were, God needed a very specific kind of leader. The text traces Ezra's lineage all the way back to Aaron, which makes him a direct descendant of the high priest. But there is a deep, defining irony here. He was a high priest, sure, but he was born in exile in Babylon. Just think about that for a second. He belonged to the ultimate priestly family, yet he grew up in a foreign land with absolutely no physical temple, no sacrifices, and he had never, not once in his entire life, stood before an altar.
So what exactly do you do when you're a priest without a temple? Well, you cling to the only piece of God you have left. Ezra is actually described using the Hebrew word mahir, which translates to an absolute expert, someone who is highly skilled or well-versed. Without a physical temple to serve in, Ezra turned entirely to the Word. He held on to it so tightly and he studied it so deeply that he became the absolute preeminent scholar of his time. It's really incredible.
And because of this intense dedication in a foreign land, there's this beautiful phrase repeated throughout Ezra's story. The good hand of his God was on him. It was this exact divine favor that granted him permission from a foreign king, guaranteed his safe travel across super dangerous terrain for 4 whole months, and gave him the immense courage he needed to restore a broken nation.
Part 5. Ezra's 3 Great Resolutions. This brings us right to the core of Ezra's methodology, which is found in Ezra 7:10, showing how he firmly set his life's purpose. His first step is anchored in the Hebrew word darash. Now, it's often translated simply as study, but darash means far, far more than just sitting at a desk reading a book. It means earnestly seeking, actively pursuing, and deeply investigating. For Ezra, studying the Word wasn't just homework, it was the active, desperate pursuit of God Himself. And this gives us a very specific 3-step order to Ezra's resolve. Step 1, study or darash. Step 2, practice or literally live it out. And step 3, teach others. Now, I want you to really notice that heavily emphasized middle step. You know, it is so tempting, especially for leaders or teachers out there, to study something and then immediately skip straight to step 3. But Ezra, he firmly set his heart to practice the Word in his own personal life first, way before he ever dared to teach it to the Israelites.
Which brings us to our final section, Part 6, our spiritual walls.
To bring these historical lessons out of ancient Jerusalem and directly into our own lives today, we really have to take a hard look at our own defenses. I mean, sure, we don't build stone walls around our cities much anymore. But let's be honest, we absolutely still build walls. We build walls of wealth to protect us from hardship. We build social networks, career status, and physical security to keep ourselves safe from the uncertainties of the world. Just like the people of ancient Jerusalem, we crave that defensive barrier. We want that security.
But history teaches us a pretty hard lesson about physical walls. They eventually crumble. The magnificent walls that Nehemiah built and the glorious structures of Jerusalem were completely decimated by the Roman army in AD 70. No matter how strong the worldly security we build is, a day will come when it's tested, shaken, and perhaps even totally destroyed. Yet, despite all those physical walls falling and the people being scattered for literally 2,000 years, the identity of the Israelites survived. How on earth is that possible? Well, it's because of Ezra. The spiritual wall that Ezra built, that deep, enduring knowledge and actual practice of the Word, proved to be completely indestructible. It was the Word, not the bricks, that kept them alive through millennia of exile. Which leaves us with this final, absolutely vital question for you. What kind of wall are you spending your time and energy building today? Are you only stacking the temporary bricks of wealth and status that are eventually going to fall? Or are you, like Ezra, earnestly seeking and practicing the enduring truths that will stand forever? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep seeking, keep building, and we'll see you next time.